In the gilded mansions of 1880s New York, where fortunes built on steel and steam commanded respect, one man's empire crumbled not from financial ruin but from a darkness that consumed his very soul. When fate stripped away everything he held dear, Theodore Blackwood became a prisoner in his own palace, his heart as cold as the winter winds that howled through Central Park. But sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, wearing the simplest of faces. What happens when an angel of mercy enters the lair of a wounded beast? The Blackwood mansion stood like a monument to American ambition on Fifth Avenue, its limestone facade gleaming in the pale October sunlight of 1883. Behind its towering windows and ornate ironwork lived Theodore Blackwood, once the most feared and respected railroad magnate in the Northeast, now a shadow of his former self. "Mr. Blackwood refuses to see anyone today," announced Mrs. Pemberton, the stern housekeeper, to the young woman standing in the marble foyer. "He's dismissed 3 caregivers this month alone." Grace Whitmore clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, her green eyes unwavering despite the warning. 24, she possessed a quiet strength that belied her humble origins in the tenements of Lower Manhattan. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her navy dress, though well mended, was spotlessly clean. "I understand he's been through a difficult time," Grace replied softly, her voice carrying the faint trace of an Irish accent inherited from her late mother. "Perhaps what he needs isn't another person trying to manage him, but someone willing to simply be present." Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened slightly. She had watched the master of the house transform from a commanding titan of industry into a bitter recluse over the past 2 years, ever since the accident that had stolen his mobility and, seemingly, his will to live. The master was thrown from his horse during a business trip to his Pennsylvania rail yards. She explained as they climbed the grand staircase, its mahogany banister polished to perfection. "The doctors say he'll never walk again. Since then, he's become ... difficult." The word difficult hardly captured the reality. Theodore Blackwood had become a tyrant in his own home, lashing out at servants, refusing medical care, and drowning his sorrows in expensive whiskey. His business partners had gradually distanced themselves, leaving him isolated in his gilded prison. They paused outside heavy oak doors adorned with brass handles. From within came the sound of something crashing against the wall, followed by a string of curses that would make a dock worker blush. "He's in one of his moods," Mrs. Pemberton whispered apologetically. Grace straightened her shoulders. "Then perhaps it's the perfect time to meet him." The housekeeper knocked gently. "Mr. Blackwood, the new caregiver is here. I told you I don't want another nursemaid," came the thunderous reply. "Send her away before I have her thrown out." Without waiting for permission, Grace turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was magnificent yet tragic. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, but heavy curtains blocked most of the light. Expensive furniture was scattered about, some pieces overturned. Books lay strewn across Persian rugs, and the air reeked of alcohol and neglect. In the center of this chaos sat Theodore Blackwood in a wheeled chair, his dark hair disheveled, his once pristine appearance now unkempt. At 35, he still possessed the strong jaw and piercing blue eyes that had once commanded boardrooms, but now those eyes burned with fury and pain. "I said get out," he roared, hurling a crystal tumbler that shattered against the wall near Grace's head. She didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly set down her satchel and began picking up the scattered books. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwood. I'm Grace Whitmore. I see you enjoy Dickens. Great Expectations is one of my favorites." Theodore stared at her in stunned silence. No one had dared ignore his outburst before. "Are you deaf, woman? I want you gone." "I heard you perfectly well," Grace replied, continuing to organize the books. "But I also heard something else in your voice. Pain, loneliness, fear." She looked up at him then, her green eyes meeting his blue ones without a trace of pity. "I'm not here to coddle you or pretend your anger isn't justified. I'm here because everyone deserves to have someone who won't abandon them, no matter how hard they try to push them away." For a moment something flickered in Theodore's eyes. Surprise, perhaps even vulnerability. But it was quickly replaced by his familiar scowl. "You know nothing about me or what I've lost." "You're right," Grace agreed, settling into a chair across from him, uninvited. "But I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. I know what it feels like when the world moves on while you're trapped in a moment of devastation." Theodore's hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair. "My legs are useless. My business is crumbling. My friends have abandoned me. What could you possibly understand about that?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with gentle honesty. "I understand that you're still breathing, which means your story isn't over. I understand that you have a choice every morning to let bitterness consume what's left of your life, or to discover what new chapters might be possible." Pretty words from someone who can walk away whenever she pleases. Theodore sneered. "You're absolutely right. I can walk away. But I won't." Grace stood and moved to the windows, pulling back the heavy curtains. Sunlight flooded the room, revealing the full extent of the chaos but also the inherent beauty of the space, because I believe that beneath all this anger is a man worth saving, even if he's forgotten that himself. Theodore squinted in the sudden brightness, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. For 2 years he had successfully driven away everyone who tried to help him, yet this slip of a girl with her calm voice and steady gaze seemed immune to his fury. "Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your quarters," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "But don't expect me to make this easy for you." Grace smiled, the first genuine smile Theodore had seen in his home for months. "I wouldn't dream of it, Mr. Blackwood. After all, the most worthwhile things in life are rarely easy." As she gathered her belongings, Theodore found himself watching her graceful movements, noting the way she handled his books with reverence, the way she moved through his space without judgment. Something stirred in his chest, an emotion he thought had died with his legs. But what secrets was this mysterious caregiver hiding, and could she truly reach the man buried beneath years of pain and rage? 3 days had passed since Grace's arrival, and the Blackwood mansion had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Theodore continued his attempts to drive her away with cutting remarks and deliberate rudeness, while Grace maintained her patient composure, quietly going about her duties of ensuring he ate, took his medications, and maintained basic hygiene. On this particular Thursday morning, the fragile peace was shattered by an unexpected visitor. "Sir, there's a gentleman here to see you," Mrs. Pemberton announced hesitantly from the doorway of Theodore's study. "Mr. Harrison Ashford from the Pennsylvania Railroad Company." Theodore's face darkened. Harrison Ashford had once been his closest business partner and dearest friend. They had built their railroad empire together, sharing dreams of connecting the vast American continent with ribbons of steel. But since the accident, Harrison's visits had become increasingly rare, and their last encounter had ended in bitter accusations. "Tell him I'm not receiving visitors," Theodore growled, not looking up from the financial reports Grace had convinced him to review. "I'm afraid he's quite insistent, sir. He says it's about the board meeting scheduled for this afternoon." Grace, who had been quietly organizing Theodore's correspondence nearby, looked up with concern. She had learned enough about his business affairs to know that today's board meeting was crucial. The other railroad barons were voting on whether to buy out Theodore's remaining shares, effectively ending his involvement in the company he had helped create. "Let him come up," Theodore said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "But Grace, you should leave us to discuss business matters." "Of course," Grace replied. But something in Theodore's tone made her linger in the hallway just outside the partially open door. Harrison Ashford strode into the room with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. Tall and distinguished, with silver threading through his dark hair, he had always been considered the more diplomatic of the two partners. But today, his usual charm was replaced by cold calculation. "Theodore," he said without preamble, "I've come to make you an offer." "Have you now?" Theodore's voice was dangerously quiet. "How generous of you, considering you haven't bothered to visit in 3 months. Harrison had the grace to look uncomfortable. "You know how difficult this situation has been for all of us. The board is concerned about the company's direction, and frankly, your condition has made it impossible for you to fulfill your duties." "My condition?" Theodore's hands clenched the arms of his wheelchair. "You mean my inability to walk?" "I wasn't aware that legs were required for strategic thinking. Don't be naive, Theodore. This business requires a man who can travel, who can meet with investors face to face, who can command respect in a boardroom. The other partners have lost confidence in your ability to lead." Grace pressed herself against the wall, her heart aching for Theodore. She could hear the pain beneath his anger, the devastating blow of being dismissed by those he had trusted. "So you've come to deliver the final blow yourself," Theodore said bitterly. "How noble of you, Harrison." "I'm offering you a way out with dignity and tact," Harrison replied, pulling a document from his briefcase. "Sign over your shares to me, and I'll ensure you receive a generous settlement, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life." "Comfortably?" Theodore's laugh was harsh, like a pensioned-off horse put out to pasture. "Be reasonable, Theodore. What alternative do you have?" "Continue to deteriorate in this mansion while your empire crumbles around you. At least this way you can maintain some semblance of pride." Grace could bear it no longer. She stepped into the doorway, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "Forgive me for interrupting, but I couldn't help overhearing. Mr. Ashford, with all due respect, you speak of Mr. Blackwood as though he were already dead." Harrison turned, startled by the interruption. His eyes swept over Grace dismissively, taking in her simple dress and modest appearance. "And you are?" "Grace Whitmore, Mr. Blackwood's caregiver. And in the 3 days I've been here, I've seen him review complex financial reports, dictate correspondence that would challenge any businessman, and demonstrate a strategic mind that remains as sharp as ever." "Miss Whitmore," Harrison said condescendingly, "you're clearly devoted to your patient, but you don't understand the complexities of running a railroad empire." "Perhaps not," Grace replied, stepping fully into the room. but I understand loyalty. I understand that true partnership means standing by someone during their darkest hour, not abandoning them when they need you most. Theodore watched this exchange with amazement. No one had defended him in months, and certainly not against someone of Harrison's stature. Grace's fierce protectiveness stirred something deep within him, a warmth he thought had been extinguished forever. Harrison's face reddened. "Young woman, you forget yourself. This is a private business matter between gentlemen. Is it gentlemanly to prey upon a man's vulnerability?" Grace shot back. "To use his physical limitations as an excuse to steal what he's spent his life building? Steal?" Harrison's voice rose. "I'm offering him fair compensation for something that isn't yours to buy," Grace said firmly. Mr. Blackwood's mind, his vision, his strategic brilliance, none of that was damaged in his accident. You're asking him to surrender not just his business, but his purpose, his identity. Theodore felt a surge of emotion he hadn't experienced since before his accident. Hope. This remarkable woman saw him not as a broken man to be pitied, but as someone worth fighting for. "Miss Whitmore speaks more sense than you do, Harrison," Theodore said, his voice growing stronger. "I won't be signing anything today." Harrison's mask of diplomacy finally slipped. "Then you're a fool, Theodore. The board will vote you out anyway. At least my offer would have given you something. It would have given me the illusion of dignity while robbing me of my soul," Theodore replied. "I'd rather fight and lose than surrender without a battle." "Fine," Harrison snapped, stuffing the papers back into his briefcase. "But don't come crawling to me when you're left with nothing. And as for you, Miss Whitmore," he turned to Grace with a sneer, "you've done your employer no favors with your interference. When this all falls apart, remember that you encouraged his delusions." After Harrison stormed out, the room fell silent. Theodore stared at Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I did," Grace replied, her voice trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "No one should have to face betrayal alone." Theodore reached out and, for the first time since her arrival, gently took her hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone believe in me." Grace felt the warmth of his touch, the vulnerability in his eyes, and realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. But as she looked into his face, she also saw the fear lurking there, the terror of hoping again, only to be disappointed. The afternoon board meeting loomed ahead, and with it, the very real possibility that Theodore would lose everything he had worked for. Could Grace's faith in him be enough to help him reclaim not just his business, but his belief in himself? The board meeting had been a disaster. Despite Theodore's passionate arguments delivered via telephone from his study, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company's board of directors had voted to remove him from his position as president. They offered him a ceremonial title and a modest pension, but his days of wielding real power were over. Grace found him that evening in his study, staring out at the darkening sky over Central Park. The financial documents lay scattered across his desk, and an untouched dinner tray sat cooling on a side table. "They called me a liability," Theodore said without turning around. 30 years of building that company, and I'm now considered a liability." Grace approached quietly, her heart breaking for the defeated man before her. "What will you do now? What can I do?" Theodore's laugh was bitter. "Harrison was right about one thing. I can't travel to meet investors. Can't command a boardroom from this chair. Perhaps it's time I accepted my limitations. Or perhaps it's time you discovered new possibilities," Grace said gently, settling into the chair beside his desk. "Tell me about your early days with the railroad. What drew you to it originally?" Theodore was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak in a voice heavy with memory. "It wasn't about the money, not at first. It was about connection, bringing isolated communities together, helping families reunite across vast distances. I remember the first time we completed a line to a small mining town in Colorado. The celebration lasted 3 days. That vision, that purpose, has that changed?" "Everything has changed," Theodore said harshly. "I'm trapped in this chair, dependent on others for the most basic needs. How can I connect anyone to anything when I can barely connect to my own life?" Grace stood and moved to the bookshelf, pulling down a leather-bound journal. "Mrs. Pemberton mentioned you used to write. May I?" Theodore nodded reluctantly, and Grace opened the journal to a random page. Her eyes widened as she read. "Theodore, this is extraordinary. You've documented not just business transactions, but the human stories behind them, the families reunited, the opportunities created, the communities transformed." "Sentimental nonsense," Theodore muttered, but Grace caught the flicker of interest in his eyes. "This isn't nonsense, this is history. This is the real story of American progress, told through the eyes of someone who lived it." Grace's voice grew excited. "Have you ever considered that your greatest contribution might not be in boardrooms, but in preserving these stories for future generations?" Theodore turned his wheelchair to face her fully. "What are you suggesting?" "A book. Your memoirs. Not just a dry business account, but the human story of building America's railroads. The triumphs, the failures, the people whose lives were changed. Grace's eyes sparkled with possibility. You have a unique perspective, Theodore. You've seen this country transform, and you have the writing skill to capture it. For the first time in days, Theodore felt a spark of genuine interest. Publishers would never take seriously the memoirs of a discredited railroad baron. They would if the book was extraordinary. And it would be because you would write it not as Theodore Blackwood, the business magnate, but as Theodore Blackwood, the storyteller, the observer of human nature. Grace moved closer, her enthusiasm infectious. Think about it. You could interview other railroad pioneers, document their stories alongside your own. You could travel not to boardrooms, but to the small towns your railroads helped build. You could see firsthand the legacy you've created. Travel? Theodore's voice was skeptical. In case you've forgotten, I'm confined to this chair. Trains are remarkably accessible for wheelchairs, Grace said with a smile. And I happen to be an excellent traveling companion. Theodore stared at her, seeing not pity in her eyes, but genuine excitement for the possibilities ahead. You would come with me? Leave New York. Leave. Whatever life you had before this. Grace's expression grew serious. Theodore, I need to tell you something about my life before I came here. I wasn't just any caregiver looking for employment. I specifically sought out this position. Theodore's brow furrowed. What do you mean? My father was Patrick Whitmore. He worked as a foreman on one of your railroad construction crews in Pennsylvania 15 years ago. Recognition dawned in Theodore's eyes. Patrick Whitmore. The bridge collapsed near Pittsburgh. He saved 6 men before the structure gave way completely. He died in that collapse, Grace said quietly, but not before ensuring his crew escaped safely. You attended his funeral, do you remember? You spoke about his courage, his dedication to his men. Theodore's voice was barely a whisper. You're Patrick's daughter, the little girl with the red hair who stood so bravely beside her mother. You established a fund for the families of the men who died that day. That fund paid for my education, allowed my mother and me to survive after Papa's death. I became a caregiver because I wanted to help people, but I sought you out specifically because I wanted to thank the man who ensured my father's sacrifice wasn't forgotten. Tears gathered in Theodore's eyes. Grace, I had no idea. You gave me a future when I had none, Grace continued. Now I want to help you see that you still have a future too. Your story, your father's story, the stories of all the brave men who built this country's railroads, they deserve to be told. Theodore reached for her hand, his touch gentle and reverent. You came here to save me, didn't you? Not as a caregiver, but as, what, an angel of mercy? Grace smiled through her own tears. I came here as someone who believes in second chances and new beginnings. I came here because I know that sometimes our greatest defeats can become our most meaningful victories. That night, Theodore began writing. Not business correspondence or financial reports, but the opening chapter of what would become his memoirs. Grace sat nearby, occasionally offering suggestions or asking questions that helped him delve deeper into his memories. As the clock struck midnight, Theodore looked up from his pages. Grace, what you're proposing, this book, this journey, it would mean spending months together, traveling across the country. People would talk. Let them talk, Grace said firmly. We'll be doing important work, preserving history, honoring the memory of brave men like my father. What could be more respectable than that? Theodore studied her face in the lamplight, seeing not just the caregiver who had challenged him to live again, but the remarkable woman who had chosen to tie her fate to his. Are you certain this is what you want? You're young, beautiful, intelligent. You could have any life you choose. I am choosing, Grace said softly. I'm choosing to believe that the best chapters of both our lives are still to be written. As Theodore returned to his writing, Grace settled back in her chair, watching the man she had come to care for more deeply than she dared admit. But could their growing connection survive the challenges that lay ahead? And what would happen when Theodore discovered the full truth about why she had really come into his life? 6 weeks later, Theodore Blackwood sat in the first-class compartment of a westbound train. His manuscript pages spread across the table before him. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails had become the soundtrack to his rebirth. Beside him, Grace reviewed their itinerary for the next stop, a small Colorado mining town where Theodore's railroad had first connected isolated communities to the wider world. We'll arrive in Silverton tomorrow morning, Grace said, consulting her notes. Mayor Henderson has arranged for you to meet with 3 of the original settlers who remember when the railroad first came through. Theodore looked up from his writing, marveling at how natural it felt to have Grace as his partner in this endeavor. Over the past month and a half, they had traveled through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, collecting stories and documenting the human impact of America's railroad expansion. The book was taking shape beautifully, but more importantly, Theodore was rediscovering his purpose. You've transformed me into something I never thought I could be, he said, watching Grace's profile as she worked. Not just a businessman, but a chronicler of history. Grace smiled, but Theodore caught a flicker of something in her expression. Worry, perhaps, or uncertainty. Before he could inquire, their compartment door slid open. Well, well, Theodore Blackwood as I live and breathe. Theodore's blood ran cold. Standing in the doorway was Victoria Ashford, Harrison's younger sister and one of New York society's most notorious gossips. Elegant and sharp-tongued, Victoria had always delighted in others' misfortunes, and her presence here could only mean trouble. Victoria, Theodore said carefully, what brings you to Colorado? Business interests, she replied smoothly, her calculating gaze shifting to Grace. Though I must say I'm far more interested in your traveling arrangements. How fascinating to find you here with your little caregiver. Grace straightened in her seat, recognizing the threat immediately. Victoria's tone dripped with insinuation, and her smile was predatory. Miss Whitmore is assisting me with my book project, Theodore said firmly. We're documenting the history of railroad development in the American West. How noble, Victoria purred, settling uninvited into the seat across from them. Though I wonder what New York society will make of such an intimate collaboration. A wealthy widower and his young, attractive employee traveling unchaperoned across the country. The scandal sheets would have a field day. Theodore's jaw tightened. There is nothing improper about our arrangement. Oh, I'm sure there isn't, Victoria said with false sweetness. But appearances matter so much, don't they? Especially for a young woman of modest means who might be seen as opportunistic. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. Mrs. Ashford, I assure you that my relationship with Mr. Blackwood is entirely professional. Of course it is, dear, Victoria replied condescendingly. Though I do hope you understand the precarious position you've placed yourself in. A woman of your background alone with a man of Theodore's wealth and vulnerability. Well, people might assume you have designs on more than just employment.
Theodore's hands gripped his wheelchair arms. Victoria, you will not speak to Miss Whitmore in that manner. I'm simply looking out for everyone's best interests, Victoria said innocently. After all, Theodore, you've been through so much. The accident, losing your position with the railroad. It would be tragic if you were to be taken advantage of in your current state. My current state. Theodore's voice was dangerously quiet.
Well, you must admit you're not quite the man you once were. Physically diminished, financially reduced, emotionally fragile. It would be so easy for an ambitious young woman to manipulate such vulnerabilities. Grace stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. How dare you? Theodore Blackwood is twice the person he was before his accident. His mind is sharper, his vision clearer, his purpose more meaningful than anything he accomplished in those boardrooms you worship. Victoria's eyes glittered with malicious delight. My. Such passion in defense of your employer, how telling, Theodore watched. Grace's fierce defense of him with a mixture of admiration and growing realization. It's the way she spoke about him, the fire in her eyes, the protective stance she took. These weren't the actions of a mere employee. Grace, he said softly, and she turned to him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears of anger. In that moment, Theodore saw the truth that had been growing between them for weeks. The connection that had deepened with every shared conversation, every collaborative moment over his manuscript. Victoria, Theodore said, never taking his eyes off Grace. I think you should return to your own compartment, but Theodore, we haven't finished our conversation. Yes, we have. Theodore's voice carried an authority that reminded everyone present of the commanding businessman he had once been. And Victoria? If I hear even a whisper of gossip about Miss Whitmore when we return to New York, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that every door in society closes to you. My influence may have diminished, but it hasn't disappeared entirely. Victoria's mask slipped, revealing the calculating woman beneath. You're making a mistake, Theodore. Both of you. This little fantasy you're living will end badly. After she left, the compartment fell silent except for the steady rhythm of the train. Theodore and Grace sat facing each other, the weight of unspoken feelings heavy between them. She's not entirely wrong, Grace said quietly. People will talk. Your reputation could suffer. My reputation? Theodore laughed, but there was no humor in it. Grace, my reputation was destroyed the moment I became confined to this chair. But you've helped me build something better than reputation. You've helped me find purpose again. Grace moved to the window, watching the Colorado landscape rush past. Theodore, there's something else I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago. Theodore's heart clenched. What is it? When I first came to you, it wasn't just about gratitude for what you did for my family after Papa's death. Grace turned to face him, her expression vulnerable. I had heard about your situation, about how you'd become isolated and bitter. That's right. I thought if I could help you heal, if I could show you that your life still had value, then perhaps I could heal something in myself too. What do you mean? I blamed myself for Papa's death, Grace whispered. He was working extra shifts to save money for my education. If I hadn't been so determined to go to school, if I had been content with less, he might not have been on that bridge when it collapsed. Theodore's heart broke for her. Grace, your father's death wasn't your fault. He worked those extra shifts because he believed in your potential, because he wanted to give you opportunities he never had. I know that now, Grace said, tears finally spilling over. You helped me see that, just as I hope I've helped you see that your accident doesn't define your worth. Theodore reached for her hand, pulling her closer to his chair. Grace, what Victoria said about people talking, about the impropriety of our situation. She's right about one thing. We can't continue as we have been. Grace's heart sank. You want me to leave? No, Theodore said firmly, his blue eyes intense with emotion. I want you to marry me. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Theodore ... double quotes, I know it seems sudden, but it isn't, not really. These past weeks, working together, sharing our stories, building something meaningful, I've fallen in love with you, Grace. Not as my caregiver, not as my assistant, but as the remarkable woman who saw worth in me when I couldn't see it in myself. Grace knelt beside his chair, her eyes searching his face. Are you certain? Marriage to me would mean accepting a life very different from what you once knew. I'm not a society lady who can enhance your status. You're something far more valuable, Theodore said, cupping her face in his hands. You're the woman who gave me back my life, my purpose, my hope. Grace Whitmore, will you marry me? Through her tears, Grace smiled, the radiant smile that had first captured Theodore's attention weeks ago. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. As the train carried them toward their Colorado destination, Theodore and Grace held each other, knowing that their love would face challenges from a society that might never fully accept their unconventional union. But could their bond survive the trials ahead, and what new adventures awaited them as they prepared to build a life together? The news of Theodore Blackwood's engagement to his caregiver spread through New York society like wildfire. By the time their train pulled into Grand Central Station 3 weeks later, the scandal sheets were already printing headlines. Railroad Baron's shocking romance, and from sick room to altar, a caregiver's rise. Grace clutched Theodore's hand as their carriage made its way through the familiar streets of Manhattan. The manuscript for his book was nearly complete, their interviews in Colorado having provided the perfect conclusion to his story of American railroad expansion. But now they faced a different kind of challenge. Are you having second thoughts? Theodore asked, noting her pale complexion as they approached the Blackwood mansion. Never about you, Grace replied firmly, but I won't pretend this'll be easy. Victoria Ashford has had 3 weeks to poison every drawing room in the city against U.S. Their fears were confirmed when Mrs. Pemberton met them at the door with a stack of calling cards and invitations, or rather, the conspicuous absence of them. Where Theodore's social calendar had once been filled with dinner parties and cultural events, now there were only a handful of cards from his most loyal friends. The Astors sent their regrets for next week's charity gala, Mrs. Pemberton reported diplomatically, and the Vanderbilts have ... postponed ... their dinner party indefinitely. Theodore's jaw tightened, but Grace squeezed his hand reassuringly. We knew this would happen. The question is, do we care? Before Theodore could answer, the butler announced an unexpected visitor. Mr. Harrison Ashford to see you, sir. Grace and Theodore exchanged glances. Harrison's arrival so soon after their return could hardly be coincidental. Harrison entered the drawing room with his usual commanding presence, but Grace noticed the strain around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Victoria's brother looked like a man carrying an unpleasant burden. Theodore, he said with a curt nod, then turned to Grace. Miss Whitmore. Or should I say, the future Mrs. Blackwood. Harrison, Theodore replied coolly. What do we owe this visit? Harrison moved to the window, gazing out at Central Park as he gathered his thoughts. I've come to discuss your ... situation. This engagement has caused quite a stir. I'm sure Victoria has made certain of that, Grace said quietly. Harrison turned, his expression troubled. My sister can be ... overzealous in her social observations. But Theodore, you must understand how this appears to others. A wealthy man, isolated and vulnerable after a devastating accident, suddenly engaged to his young caregiver. People are questioning your judgment. Are you questioning my judgment, Harrison? Theodore's voice was dangerously quiet. I'm questioning your timing, Harrison replied, and your motivations. Both of yours. Grace stood, her chin raised defiantly. Mr. Ashford, if you have something to say about my character, please say it directly. Harrison studied her for a long moment. Very well. There are those who believe you've manipulated Theodore's emotional state for financial gain. that you've taken advantage of a man in his darkest hour. And what do you believe? Grace asked steadily. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, then sighed heavily. I believe I've watched my oldest friend transform from a broken, bitter man into someone I barely recognize. Someone, better than he was before. Theodore looked up sharply. What are you saying? I'm saying that in 30 years of friendship, I've never seen you as content as you appeared in those letters you sent from Colorado. Your writing about the book project, your descriptions of the people you met, the stories you collected. There was a passion there I hadn't seen since we were young men building our first railroad line. Harrison moved closer, his expression earnest. Theodore, I owe you an apology. When you were injured, when you became difficult and angry, I abandoned you. I told myself it was business, that the company came first. But the truth is, I was afraid of seeing my strong, invincible friend reduced to what I thought was weakness. And now, Theodore asked? Now I see that what I mistook for weakness was actually the beginning of wisdom. You've found something more valuable than business success, haven't you? Theodore reached for Grace's hand, his eyes never leaving Harrison's face. I've found purpose beyond profit. I've found love beyond convenience. And I've found a partner who sees not what I've lost, but what I can still become. Harrison nodded slowly. Then I have a proposition for you both. He pulled a document from his briefcase. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company has received an offer from a publishing house in Boston. They want to commission a comprehensive history of American railroad development written by someone with first-hand experience. The advance is substantial, and the potential royalties could provide a comfortable living. Grace gasped. They want Theodore's book? They want more than that, Harrison said. They want a series. Multiple volumes covering different aspects of American expansion, railroads, mining, agriculture, industry. They want Theodore to be the primary author, with the freedom to travel and research as needed. Theodore stared at the contract in amazement. How did they even know about my work? Harrison smiled sheepishly. I may have shared some excerpts from your letters. The passion in your writing, the human stories you've collected, it's exactly what they're looking for. This would mean vindication, Grace said softly. Recognition that your work has value beyond the boardroom. It would mean independence, Theodore added, understanding the full implications. Financial security that doesn't depend on railroad stock or board positions. Harrison extended his hand to Theodore. It would mean a chance for me to make amends for abandoning my friend when he needed me most. Theodore, will you forgive an old fool who confused strength with stubbornness? Theodore gripped Harrison's hand firmly. Only if you'll stand with us against the gossips and scandalmongers. It would be my honor, Harrison replied. Then he turned to Grace. Miss Whitmore, I owe you an apology as well. I judged you without knowing you, assumed the worst without evidence. You've given my friend back his life, and for that, you have my eternal gratitude. Grace smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Ashford. That means more than you know. As Harrison prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Theodore, there's one more thing. The publishing house wants to announce the book series at a grand literary reception next month. All of New York's cultural elite will be there. Writers, intellectuals, patrons of the arts. It would be the perfect opportunity to introduce you and Grace as a respected literary couple rather than the subject of scandal. After Harrison left, Theodore and Grace sat in comfortable silence, absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Not only had Theodore's oldest friendship been restored, but their future together had been secured in a way that would command respect rather than whispers. A literary reception, Grace mused. Can you imagine? 6 months ago, you were a bitter recluse and I was an unknown caregiver. Now we're about to be celebrated as chroniclers of American history. Theodore pulled her closer, marveling at the woman who had changed his entire world. Grace, are you ready for this? A life of travel and research, of literary salons and intellectual discourse? It's so different from the quiet domestic life most women expect. Grace laughed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Theodore Blackwood, I fell in love with a man who sees possibilities where others see limitations. Did you really think I'd want an ordinary life? As they began planning their wedding and their future together, neither Theodore nor Grace noticed the figure watching from across the street. Victoria Ashford stood in the shadows, her face twisted with rage and calculation. If society wouldn't shun the happy couple, perhaps she would have to take more direct action to destroy their newfound happiness. But what lengths would Victoria go to in her quest for revenge? And could Theodore and Grace's love survive one final devastating attack? 1 year later, the morning sun cast golden rays across the sprawling Blackwood estate in the Hudson Valley, illuminating what had once been a forgotten countryside manor and was now the prestigious American Institute for Historical Documentation. Grace stood at the tall windows of what had been the estate's ballroom, now converted into a magnificent library and lecture hall, watching as carriages and automobiles arrived for their first annual Railroad Heritage Symposium. The transformation had been remarkable. What Theodore had purchased as a retreat from New York society had evolved into something far more significant, a center of learning that attracted scholars, writers, and historians from across the nation. The estate's grounds had been carefully landscaped to include walking paths accessible for wheelchairs, and the main house had been renovated to accommodate both residential guests and academic conferences. Mrs. Blackwood called Mrs. Pemberton, who had gladly followed the couple to their new life and now served as the estate's head administrator. The delegates from the Smithsonian Institution have arrived, and Professor Williams from Harvard is in the East Wing Library with Mr. F. Blackwood reviewing the manuscript for Volume 3 of the Chronicles. Grace smiled, adjusting the fresh flowers she had arranged in crystal vases throughout the hall. At 26, she had grown into her role as both Theodore's wife and his intellectual partner with a grace that surprised even her. Her auburn hair was now styled in the latest fashion, and her emerald green dress was of the finest silk. But her eyes still held the same warmth and determination that had first captured Theodore's attention. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. Please ensure our guests are comfortable in the morning reception room. I'll join them shortly." The past year had exceeded even their most optimistic dreams. Theodore's Chronicles of American Progress had become the definitive work on railroad history, with the first volume selling over 50,000 copies and earning praise from critics as far away as London and Paris. Universities across the country had begun incorporating his work into their curricula, and the Blackwood Institute had received requests for research partnerships from institutions throughout America and Europe. More importantly, their marriage had flourished beyond the gossip and scandal that had initially surrounded it. The literary and academic communities had embraced them as a power couple of intellectual achievement, and even New York society had grudgingly come to respect their accomplishments. Theodore's transformation from bitter recluse to celebrated author had become the stuff of legend, while Grace's evolution from caregiver to respected historical researcher had inspired young women across the country. Grace made her way through the estate's corridors, past walls lined with photographs from their research travels, images of railroad workers, frontier families, and the communities that had grown up around the expanding rail network. Each photograph told a story, and together they formed a visual narrative of American progress that complemented Theodore's written chronicles. She paused at the doorway of the East Wing Library, watching her husband work with Professor Williams. Theodore sat at his specially designed desk, his wheelchair positioned perfectly for comfort and efficiency. His dark hair was now touched with distinguished silver at the temples, and his blue eyes sparkled with the intellectual passion that had made him one of America's most respected historical authors. The bitter, broken man she had first encountered seemed like a distant memory. The chapter on the Transcontinental Railroad's impact on Native American communities is particularly powerful, Professor Williams was saying, his voice filled with admiration. "You've managed to present multiple perspectives without losing the narrative thread. It's masterful storytelling combined with rigorous scholarship." Theodore looked up and caught sight of Grace in the doorway. His face immediately brightened with the smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Ah, there's my most valuable research partner. Professor Williams, you remember my wife, Grace?" "Indeed. Mrs. Blackwood, your contributions to the Chronicles have been invaluable. The interviews you conducted with the railroad workers. Families provide a human dimension that elevates the entire work above mere historical documentation." Grace entered the room, her hand naturally finding Theodore's shoulder in a gesture of affection that had become second nature. "Professor Williams, you're too kind. Theodore's vision and writing talent are what make the Chronicles special. I simply help gather the stories." "Nonsense," Theodore said, covering her hand with his. "Grace has an extraordinary gift for making people comfortable enough to share their most personal memories. Without her, the Chronicles would be nothing more than dry business records and construction statistics." Professor Williams nodded enthusiastically. "Speaking of which, I have exciting news from Harvard. The university would like to offer you both visiting fellowships for the spring semester. You would have access to our archives, research facilities, and the opportunity to lecture to our graduate students." Grace and Theodore exchanged glances, their silent communication perfected over months of collaboration. "We're honored by the invitation," Theodore replied. "We'll certainly consider it, though our travel schedule for Volume 4 research is quite demanding." Of course. The field research must come first. But please know that Harvard would be thrilled to have you both on campus whenever your schedule permits." After Professor Williams departed to join the other symposium attendees, Grace and Theodore had a few moments alone in the library. The room had become their sanctuary, filled with Theodore's research materials, Grace's interview notes, and the comfortable chaos of intellectual pursuit. A Harvard fellowship, Grace mused, settling into the chair beside Theodore's desk. Can you imagine? 2 years ago, I was an unknown caregiver, and you were ... a bitter, broken man who had given up on life. Theodore finished with a rueful smile. It seems like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? Grace reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. Sometimes I wonder if we're living in a dream. The success of the books, this beautiful estate, the respect we've earned in academic circles, it all seems too wonderful to be real. It's real because we built it together, Theodore said, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. Every interview, every late night of writing, every mile we've traveled, we've earned every bit of this success. Their intimate moment was interrupted by a soft knock on the library door. Mrs. Pemberton entered with a concerned expression. Forgive the interruption, but there's a situation that requires your attention. Miss Victoria Ashford has arrived and is causing a disturbance in the reception room. Grace felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. Victoria Ashford had been conspicuously absent from their lives since their wedding, but Grace had always known that Harrison's vindictive sister wouldn't simply disappear. Theodore's jaw tightened, and she could see the protective instincts that had developed over their marriage beginning to surface. What kind of disturbance? Theodore asked carefully. She's questioning several of our guests about Mrs. Blackwood's background. She seems to have brought some sort of documentation that she's showing too. Grace and Theodore exchanged worried glances. They had hoped that Victoria's capacity for mischief had been exhausted, but clearly they had underestimated her persistence and vindictiveness. We should go, Grace said, standing with determination. Whatever she's planning. It's better to face it directly than let her poison the atmosphere of our symposium. Theodore nodded, maneuvering his wheelchair toward the door. Mrs. Pemberton, please ask Harrison to join us in the reception room. If his sister is causing trouble, he should be present. The reception room buzzed with uncomfortable tension when they arrived. Grace immediately noticed that their guests had separated into small clusters, with Victoria Ashford at the center of the largest group, holding court like a malicious queen. She had aged poorly in the past year, her face bearing the lines of constant bitterness and failed schemes. But her voice carried clearly across the room. I simply think people have a right to know the truth about the so-called heroic Patrick Whitmore, Victoria was saying to a captivated audience of scholars and journalists. The official reports were quite deliberately suppressed, but I've managed to obtain copies of the original investigation. Grace felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized the familiar dread of her deepest shame being exposed. Theodore's hand found hers, squeezing gently in support, but she could see the confusion in his eyes. Whatever Victoria was revealing, it was clearly news to him as well. Ladies and gentlemen, Theodore announced, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded boardrooms and now commanded lecture halls. I believe we should address whatever concerns Miss Ashford has raised directly, rather than allowing speculation to continue. Victoria turned with a triumphant smile that made Grace's skin crawl. Theodore, how perfect. I was just sharing some fascinating historical documentation with your guests. It seems your wife's family history is even more colorful than we previously knew. She held up a folder of official-looking documents. According to the original Pennsylvania Railroad investigation into the bridge collapse that killed 6 workers, including Patrick Whitmore, there were significant questions about negligence and safety violations that were never properly addressed. Grace felt the room's attention focus on her like a physical weight. Several of the journalists present had pulled out notebooks, sensing a story that could overshadow the academic symposium entirely. The investigation, Victoria continued with malicious glee, reveals that Patrick Whitmore had been drinking heavily on the job for weeks before the accident. His negligence in following safety protocols may have directly contributed to the structural failure that killed 6 men. A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled guests. Grace felt her knees weaken, but Theodore's presence beside her provided an anchor of strength. She'd always suspected there was more to her father's story than the heroic narrative she had been told, but hearing it exposed so publicly was devastating. Furthermore, Victoria pressed on, clearly enjoying the drama she was creating. The railroad company's generous settlement to the victims' families was apparently motivated more by guilt over covering up the negligence than by genuine compassion for the bereaved. That's enough, Theodore said, his voice cutting through Victoria's monologue like a blade. Miss Ashford, you've made your point. Now perhaps you'd like to explain why you've chosen to ambush my wife with this information at a scholarly symposium rather than addressing your concerns privately. Victoria's eyes glittered with malice. Because, dear Theodore, I thought your distinguished guests should know the truth about the woman you've elevated to such prominence in academic circles. After all, if her entire family narrative is built on lies and cover-ups, what does that say about her credibility as a historical researcher? The room fell silent except for the scratching of pencils as journalists took notes. Grace felt exposed and vulnerable, but as she looked around at the faces of their guests, She saw not condemnation but curiosity and in many cases sympathy. "Miss Ashford," came a voice from the back of the room. Harrison Ashford pushed through the crowd, his face dark with embarrassment and anger. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" "I'm revealing the truth that everyone has been too polite to investigate," Victoria replied defiantly. "This woman has built her reputation on a foundation of lies about her father's heroism." Harrison looked mortified. "Victoria, you will cease this behavior immediately and apologize to our hosts." "I will not apologize for exposing fraud and deception," Victoria shot back. Theodore moved his wheelchair forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Grace in a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by their guests. "Miss Ashford, since you seem so concerned with historical accuracy, perhaps you'd like to hear the complete story rather than the selective portions that serve your narrative." He turned to address the room, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a practiced lecturer. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your patience with this unexpected drama. Since Miss Ashford has chosen to make my wife's family history a matter of public discussion, I believe you deserve to hear the full truth." Grace looked at her husband in amazement, wondering how he could possibly defend her father's actions when she herself had struggled to come to terms with them. "Patrick Whitmore was indeed drinking on the day of the bridge collapse," Theodore continued, his voice steady and clear. "He had been struggling with alcohol for several months following the death of his wife from tuberculosis. He was a man drowning in grief, trying to support his young daughter while battling his own demons." The room listened in rapt attention as Theodore continued. "The investigation Miss Ashford references did find evidence of safety protocol violations. Patrick had failed to properly inspect several support cables, and his judgment was clearly impaired by alcohol. These failures contributed to the structural weakness that caused the collapse." Grace felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but Theodore's voice remained strong and compassionate. "However," Theodore said, his tone shifting, "what Miss Ashford's selective reading of the documents fails to mention is what happened when the bridge began to fail. Patrick Whitmore, despite his impaired state, despite his own safety, spent his final minutes on Earth ensuring that his crew escaped the collapsing structure. He physically pushed 2 men to safety, shouted warnings that allowed 3 others to reach secure ground, and died while attempting to rescue the 6th worker who was trapped under fallen debris." Theodore paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "The railroad company's settlement wasn't motivated by guilt over a cover-up. It was motivated by recognition that a flawed man had chosen to act heroically in his final moments, and that his sacrifice deserved to be honored despite his earlier failures." Professor Williams stepped forward from the crowd. "Mr. Blackwood, are you saying that you've known about these circumstances throughout your research and writing?" "I've known since the day I first investigated the accident," Theodore replied. "I made it my business to understand every detail of what happened that day, including the personal struggles of the men involved." He turned to Grace, his eyes filled with love and understanding. "I also made it my business to understand how that tragedy shaped the remarkable woman who became my wife." Grace has never hidden from the complexity of her father's story. She has simply chosen to honor both his failures and his final act of courage. Grace found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. "My father was not a perfect man. He struggled with grief and turned to alcohol when he should have sought help. His negligence contributed to a tragedy that claimed 6 lives, including his own." She straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from Theodore's unwavering support. "But I've learned that heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to do right when it matters most, regardless of your past mistakes. My father's final act doesn't erase his failures, but his failures don't erase his final act of courage." Dr. Margaret Thornton, the respected female historian who had become one of their closest friends, stepped forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, your father's story is actually a perfect example of the complex human narratives that make your research so valuable. Real people aren't heroes or villains. They're complicated individuals capable of both failure and redemption." Several other guests nodded in agreement, and Grace began to realize that Victoria's attempt to destroy her reputation was actually backfiring. The academic community respected nuanced truth more than simple heroic narratives. Furthermore, Professor Williams added, "Mrs. Blackwood's personal experience with the complexity of human nature has clearly informed her ability to conduct sensitive interviews with historical subjects. Her work demonstrates exactly the kind of empathetic understanding that produces the most valuable historical research." Victoria's face had grown increasingly red as she realized that her dramatic revelation was not having the desired effect. "You're all missing the point," she exclaimed. "This woman has built her entire identity on a lie." "No," said a quiet voice from near the doorway. Everyone turned to see an elderly man in work clothes, his hands weathered by decades of manual labor. "Ma'am, if I may speak," Theodore recognized him immediately. "Of course, Mr. O'Brien, please come forward." Patrick O'Brien, one of the railroad workers they had interviewed for the Chronicles, stepped into the room with the dignity of a man who had lived through history. "I was there that day," he said simply. "I was one of the men Patrick Whitmore saved." The room fell completely silent as O'Brien continued. "Miss, I don't know what papers you've got there, but I can tell you what I saw with my own eyes. Patrick Whitmore was drinking, that's true. He'd been drinking since his wife died, and we all knew it. But when that bridge started coming down, he didn't think about himself for 1 second. O'Brien's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "He grabbed me and Tommy Sullivan and threw us clear of the collapse zone. Then he went back for the others. I watched him die trying to pull Jim Morrison out from under a fallen beam. And that man may have made mistakes, but he died a hero. And anyone who says different wasn't there." Grace felt tears streaming down her face as this stranger, this man her father had saved, defended Patrick Whitmore's memory with simple, powerful truth. Victoria looked around the room desperately, realizing that her carefully planned attack had completely failed. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "You're all being manipulated by sentiment," and Victoria, Harrison interrupted firmly. "You will stop this immediately. You've embarrassed yourself and our family quite enough." He turned to Theodore and Grace with genuine remorse. "I apologize for my sister's behavior. Her actions today are inexcusable, and she will be leaving immediately." As Harrison escorted a protesting Victoria from the room, the remaining guests began to disperse, many approaching Grace and Theodore to express their support and admiration for how they had handled the situation. Dr. Thornton was among the last to approach them. "Grace, Theodore, what happened here today actually demonstrates something important about your work. You've shown that the most powerful historical narratives aren't about perfect heroes, but about real people facing real challenges and sometimes rising above their limitations." Professor Williams nodded in agreement. "Mrs. Blackwood, your father's story, the complete story, including his struggles and his sacrifice, is exactly the kind of complex human narrative that makes history meaningful. I hope you'll consider including it in a future volume of the Chronicles." That evening, after their guests had departed and the estate had settled into peaceful quiet, Theodore and Grace sat together on their private terrace overlooking the Hudson River. The manuscript for Theodore's 4th book lay completed on the table between them, and letters from universities requesting lectures were stacked nearby. Grace leaned against Theodore's shoulder, still processing the emotional intensity of the day. "I can't believe you knew all along about Papa's drinking, about the negligence report. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Theodore's arm tightened around her waist. "Because it wasn't my story to tell. I knew that when you were ready to discuss your father's complete legacy, both his failures and his heroism, you would bring it up yourself. But weren't you angry when you discovered the truth? Didn't you feel deceived?" Theodore turned to face her, his blue eyes serious and loving. "Grace, I fell in love with a woman who dedicated her life to caring for others because she understood the weight of human frailty and the power of second chances. Learning about your father's struggles only helped me understand where that compassion came from." Grace felt fresh tears forming. "I was so ashamed. I thought if you knew the truth, you might see me differently. The only thing I see differently is how much courage it took for you to build a life dedicated to healing and helping others, despite carrying that burden of knowledge." Theodore took her hands in his. "Your father's mistakes don't define you any more than my accident defines me. We are who we choose to become, not who we were in our darkest moments." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge over the Hudson Valley. Finally, Grace spoke again. "Do you think we should include Papa's story in the Chronicles? The complete story, I mean." Theodore considered this carefully. "Only if you want to. But I think Dr. Thornton and Professor Williams were right. Stories like your father's are what make history human and meaningful. The Chronicles aren't just about celebrating American progress. They're about understanding the real people who built this country with all their complexities and contradictions." Grace nodded slowly. "I think I'd like that. I think Papa would want his complete story told, not just the heroic parts." "Then we'll include it in Volume 5, Theodore said. "We'll tell the story of Patrick Whitmore, a man who struggled with grief, made serious mistakes, but ultimately chose courage over self-preservation in his final moments." As they prepared to go inside, Grace paused to look back at the estate they had built together. The main house glowed warmly in the darkness, its windows revealing the library where they worked, the guest rooms where visiting scholars stayed, and the conference halls where important historical discussions took place. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up the railroad empire for this life?" Theodore smiled, his expression filled with contentment. "I gave up an empire built on steel and steam for one built on love and purpose. How could I possibly regret that?" Grace leaned into his embrace, marveling at the journey that had brought them here. "When I first walked into your study that day, I thought I was there to save you, and instead we saved each other," Theodore murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We learned that sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom not in carefully tended gardens, but in the places where they're planted by chance and nurtured by love." The next morning brought news that would cement their legacy in ways they had never imagined. A telegram arrived from the Library of Congress, requesting that the Blackwood Institute become the official repository for oral histories related to American industrial development. Another telegram came from the president himself, inviting Theodore to serve on a national commission for historical preservation. But perhaps most meaningful was a letter from a young woman in California who had read about the previous day's events in a newspaper account. She wrote that Grace's courage in facing her family's complex history had inspired her to pursue her own dreams of becoming a historian, despite coming from a family that had faced its own struggles and scandals. "You see," Theodore said as Grace finished reading the letter aloud, "your willingness to embrace the complete truth about your father's story, both his failures and his heroism, has already inspired someone else to pursue their dreams despite their own family's complications." Grace folded the letter carefully, adding it to the growing collection of correspondence from people whose lives had been touched by their work. "I never imagined that our personal struggles could become part of something larger, something that might help other people." "That's the power of authentic storytelling," Theodore replied. "When we're willing to share not just our triumphs, but our struggles, we give others permission to embrace their own complex truths." As autumn deepened into winter, the Blackwood Institute continued to flourish. Scholars from around the world came to study their archives, and the Chronicles series had expanded to include volumes on mining, agriculture, and industrial development. Grace had become a respected historian in her own right, with universities competing to host her lectures on oral history methodology. But perhaps most importantly, their marriage had deepened into something that transcended their initial attraction and mutual rescue. They had become true partners in every sense, intellectual collaborators, emotional supporters, and devoted companions who had learned to find joy in both their shared successes and their individual growth. One snowy December evening, as they worked together in their library preparing for their next research expedition, Grace looked up from her notes to find Theodore watching her with an expression of profound contentment. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am for that day when a stubborn young woman refused to be intimidated by my anger and saw something worth saving in a broken man." Grace smiled, setting down her pen and moving to sit on the arm of his chair. "And I'm thinking about how grateful I am for a man who taught me that our greatest defeats can become our most meaningful victories." Theodore reached up to touch her face gently. "We've built something extraordinary together, haven't we? Not just this institute or the books, but this life, this partnership, this love that's strong enough to weather any storm. Even Victoria Ashford's worst efforts," Grace added with a laugh. "Especially Victoria Ashford's worst efforts," Theodore agreed. "She actually did us a favor, by forcing us to confront your father's complete story publicly. She helped us demonstrate that our work is built on authentic truth, not comfortable myths." As the snow continued to fall outside their windows, Grace and Theodore Blackwood sat surrounded by the life they had built together, a life dedicated to preserving the complex, beautiful, difficult truths of American history. Their love story had become one of redemption and second chances, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary partnerships begin not with passion at first sight, but with the simple decision to see worth in someone the world has forgotten. They had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in stock certificates or social standing, but in the courage to love deeply, to forgive completely, and to build something meaningful from the ashes of what once was. Their story had become a testament to the transformative power of love, the importance of second chances, and the beautiful truth that sometimes we must lose everything we thought we wanted in order to find everything we actually needed. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the snowy valley, a reminder of the empire Theodore had lost and the far greater kingdom he had found in Grace's arms. They had learned to bloom exactly where life had planted them, and in doing so, they had created something more beautiful and lasting than either had ever dared to dream. And so concludes the extraordinary journey of Theodore and Grace, a story that reminds us that our greatest failures can transform into our most significant victories, and that true love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds of the soul. From that shadowy mansion in New York to the vast landscapes of the American West, we witnessed the transformation of a man embittered by fate into a respected chronicler of history, and of a humble caregiver into an intellectual partner admired throughout the country. But above all, we witnessed the birth of a love that transcended social conventions and proved that sometimes the most powerful connections arise in the most unexpected moments. The story of Theodore and Grace teaches us that true wealth isn't found in the fortunes we accumulate or the status we achieve, but in the courage to love deeply, forgive completely, and build something meaningful from the ashes of what once was. They discovered that blooming where life plants us can create something more, beautiful and lasting than any empire built on steel and steam. If this story of redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of love touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring historical dramas that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest episodes, where we explore the hidden treasures of American history, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, of loves that defied conventions, and of dreams that refused to die. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their story isn't over, no matter how dark their current chapter might seem. Leave a comment telling us. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone saw potential in you that you couldn't see in yourself? Your experience might inspire our next dramatic tale. And if you want to dive even deeper into the fascinating stories of America's Gilded Age, check out our special playlist featuring other epic romances set in this era of transformation and infinite possibilities. Thank you for joining us in celebrating the extraordinary love stories hidden within America's rich historical tapestry. Until our next adventure, remember, sometimes the most beautiful endings begin exactly where we thought everything had come to an end. Subscribe now and become part of our community of history lovers.